Luke chapter 15, and this is going to be kind of a lengthy reading today. We're going to start in verse 11 in just a few minutes. So you want to go ahead and be turning there because I'm probably not going to be able to get this up on the screen today. While you're looking there, I don't know if I've told you this story before, but there was a lady by the name of Rose Crawford. And she had been blind for some 50 years. And then one day she hears about this procedure in Ontario, Canada. And so she goes to Ontario, Canada. She has this surgery and they take the bandages off, and guess what? Immediately she is able to see. Now I want you to kind of imagine that in your mind. Here is an individual that for 50 years has been in the dark, hasn't been able to see anything. And then this surgery happens, the bandages come off, and now for the first time, she's able to see. Can you imagine what that must be like? And I think about, the times that really this happens in people's lives spiritually. In fact, one of the phrases that we love to use is the light just came on. Yeah, anybody ever heard that phrase? Yeah, absolutely. The light just came on. And what we mean by that is there was something that this individual couldn't see before, and then something happened to where now, man, they see it. I mean, it's crystal clear. It's right there. And because they're able to see it, man, now that changes everything. The light just, it came on. And that's one of the awesome things about being a minister, because I get to see this all the time. I mean, there have been times when I've been studying the Bible with people and there was something that God wanted them to see for years, but they just hadn't got to that point yet. They just hadn't gotten to a place to where they could see it, and then all of a sudden they get it. They understand it. The light comes on. I'll never forget. Several years ago, Julie and I, we were studying with some of our friends. And they had asked us about baptism. They said, why do you guys place so much emphasis on baptizing? Why do you guys think that baptism is so important and even essential? And we talked about this last week. If you weren't here last week, I want to encourage you to get the CD on this, okay? So that you can get a better layout of what I'm talking about this morning, or you can watch it online. But he said, why do you guys think baptism is so important? And so I took him to Acts chapter 2, and then we went to Acts chapter 8, and we went to Acts chapter 10, and then we went to Acts chapter 16, and we went to Acts chapter 19, and Acts chapter 22, and I was showing him every conversion in the Bible included baptism. And we looked at Romans chapter 6 and 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 21 and Galatians chapter 3. We're going through all those scriptures, and after we go through it, he looks at me and he says, I just don't see it. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And he's like, I just don't get what you're saying. In fact, he says, what do you do with the criminal on the cross? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, the criminal on the cross wasn't baptized, and yet he was saved. And I just simply looked at him and I said, well, you have to understand that he was still under the old law, the law of sacrifices, animal sacrifices, like we read before the Lord's Supper this morning, and their sins were rolled forward. Abraham, Isaac, that whole generation, their sins were rolled forward till the coming of Christ. I said he died under the old law. In fact, the first gospel sermon where Peter stood up and preached repentance and baptism for the remission of sins didn't take place until some 50 days later. And he said, let me see that Bible again. And he got my Bible and he went to Acts chapter 2 verse 38 and he read it and he goes, I get it. And he said, why didn't I see this before? He said, it's like the light just came on for me. And he said, let me tell you something, you're not leaving here till I'm baptized. And his wife said, well, you're baptizing me as well. But those moments where you're studying with people and all of a sudden something they haven't seen before, it comes on. they throw the switch. And maybe it's not anything biblical. Maybe it's a bad circumstance. How many of you have ever seen someone who has lost a loved one? I mean, they're as far from God as they can be, and that's the way they want it, and I don't believe in God, and then they lose a loved one, or they lose their job, or their spouse leaves them, and then all of a sudden it's, God, help me. God, I need you in my life. All of a sudden, now their life has collided with the truth of God. The light comes on, and they have this awakening. Or it didn't even have to be a bad thing, right? I mean, how many of you have ever seen someone who is apart from God and then they have a child? Or they get married, and now that these things are starting to progress in their life, now they start thinking on spiritual things. The light comes on and they understand it, and they begin to get it. But I think all of us, right? I mean, we've all had situations in our lives where there was something at one point in our life we just couldn't see it before, and then all of a sudden the light comes on, and it changes our lives forever. And that's my prayer today. And that's what I've been praying about all this week, is that if there's anyone here today that needs to come to Christ, or if there is anyone here today that is living apart from Christ, if there's anyone here today that needs to see something that God wants them to see, I'm praying that today is the day they throw the switch. In fact, I think about Paul in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 8. This was his prayer. He says, I pray also that the what, church? The eyes of your what, church? Your heart may be open. I'm praying that the eyes of your heart will be open, that you will understand this, that you will receive this, that you will get this. But here's the question, how does that happen? I mean, we're talking about throwing the switch. We're talking about having this spiritual awakening where the light comes on. How does that happen? Well, there was a guy, a minister, several years ago by the name of Kyle Idleman. And he wrote a book entitled Aha. And in this book, he talks about those God moments that change everything. And he talks about this very thing. In fact, he gives three ingredients on how the light comes on for people spiritually and stays on spiritually. And for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at those same three ingredients. But here's number one. Here's the first thing that he mentions in his book: a sudden awakening. In order for the light to come on, there has to be this sudden awakening. Let's look at the parable of the prodigal son, Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11. It says, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. Okay, so let's stop right there, because this is very important for all of us to see. You've got 2 sons, and the younger son comes to his father, and essentially this is what he says: Dad, I can't wait for you to die. Are you with me? Isn't that heartless? I can't wait for you to die. Give me my inheritance now. And here's what blows me away: the father gives it to him. Because keep reading, it says, so he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? He says, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. Kind of an interesting story, right? I mean, here you have two boys, and the youngest of the boys goes to his father, says, Dad, I can't wait for you to die. Give me my inheritance now. His father gives it to him, and he takes off for this distant country because he is at a point in his life where, you know what? He's decided, I don't need the father. Now, there's two things that I want you to understand about this story that Jesus Himself is telling you. The father in the story represents God. And secondly, the distant country represents any area of our lives where we say to God, hands off, I want some space here. I want to do what I want to do. Are you with me? And that sounds pretty fun, doesn't it? I mean, initially, when you read this, you're like, yeah, man, the younger son, he goes to a distant country, and he's spending all this money, and he's living any way he wants to live. But here's what I've discovered throughout the years, that those who are residents of the distant country, it doesn't stay fun very long. Initially, it's fun, but at some point, a life lived apart from the Father. And you have to understand this. Write this down today. This is important. You need to get it. Life lived apart from the Father falls apart. I'm telling you. Not only have I lived that, but I have also talked to other residents of the distant country. Are you with me? And every single one of them talk about, man, it started off absolutely wonderful, doing what I want to do. But then eventually the wheels fall off, don't they? Because we're apart from God. And here's the question. For the prodigal son, for the younger son, he's living apart from the Father, and the question is this, what's it going to take to bring him back? I mean, how far is he going to have to go down this road before he realizes that, you know what, this isn't what I really wanted. This doesn't really work. How many of you use an alarm in the mornings? Okay, I guarantee you that probably all of your alarms have two settings, right? I mean, most alarms do. There is the radio setting. Anybody use the radio setting this morning? Okay, a few of you do. Beware, okay? Because this has happened to me. There have been times where the alarm goes off, and instead of some, I don't know, hard rock, heavy music to wake me up, it was this soothing music that put me deeper into sleep. Are you with me? And I'm like showing up late at church, you know, and that's not good for a preacher. And so I had to get off the radio setting, and I had to put on the alarm setting, right? Will you guys play the alarm setting? Give me a sample of that this morning. You guys will know what it is. Isn't that crazy? I mean, you just want to grab your ears. That's good. I can't take anymore. Right? I mean, you want to grab your ears. It drives you crazy. It drives you out of bed, right? Because it's so terrible. You got to wake up. Right? Your eyes have got to open when you hear that sound. Why? Because it's just so terrible. It's so bad. And so again, going back to the prodigal son, how bad does it have to get before he wakes up and realizes this doesn't work? Let me tell you, it had to get bad. I mean, the alarm had to get really loud. If you go back and you look at the text, notice what it says. He ran through all of his money. After he ran through all of his money, there was a famine in the land. In other words, there was no food really to be had. They couldn't grow anything. So there's no food. He's got no money. And so now he's looking around, well, I got to get a job. And so the only job that was available, guess what? Was feeding pigs. How many of you want to feed pigs for a living? That's awesome. So the kids raise their hand. That's great. Okay, y'all just killed my illustration. But anyway, right? I mean, here's what makes this so problematic for him. Jesus is telling the story, and so more than likely he's talking about a Jew. How do Jews regard pigs? They're unclean. I mean, this was like the worst job ever. But I mean, feeding pigs. And so he takes it. I mean, he's starving. And so he takes his job. And I guess he's looking maybe to those friends, right, who was helping him party and blow through his inheritance. But it says, guess what? No one would give him anything. The friends were gone. He had no help. And then he gets to the point where he hits rock bottom. Not only is he feeding pigs, but he starts to desire their food. He wants to eat the pig slop that he is feeding them. That's how bad things had gotten. And you think about that today, what's it going to take? How bad does it have to get? You know, I remember I had a friend several years ago who was telling me about his brother, and his brother was an alcoholic, and he said, man, you know, I'd go to my brother and I'd try and talk to him and try and reason with him, and he just would not listen to me. And before it was all said and done, he said he lost his beautiful family, he lost an amazing job, and he lost all of his possessions. Because he wouldn't listen. When I was in college, I had a friend who loved to party, man. He loved to stay up late at night, and he loved to drink, and eventually it would catch up to him, and so he would sleep throughout the day, and he wasn't going to his classes, and me and some of the other guys, we were going to him, and we were trying to talk to him, and he wouldn't listen, and guess what? He ended up failing out of school. He flunked out. And so you begin asking that question, man, how bad does it have to get? How loud does the alarm have to get for us to, you know, to wake up at times? And here's the deal. Here's what you have to understand. Listen, no one purposely sleeps through the alarm, right? I mean, when someone sets an alarm, there's the intention of getting up and getting wherever they need to be. And so when they sleep through the alarm, it's just because, you know, they just didn't wake up. The alarm just did not get their attention, but went on purpose. Why don't people wake up to where they are? I think many times one of our greatest problems is denial. We don't want to admit it. Right? I mean, I'm a good person. I'm a good dad. I'm a good mom. I'm a good parent. I'm a good Christian. Right? And we deny the fact that there is something going on in our life, that there's a problem there that we are not addressing. Sigmund Freud, he gives a great definition of denial. He says, denial is a defense mechanism in which a person is faced with a fact that is too uncomfortable to accept and therefore rejects it in spite of the overwhelming evidence. In other words, the evidence is there. It's crystal clear. There's a problem, but it's just too uncomfortable to accept it and say, yes, I've got a problem. In this book that Kyle writes, he talks about 3 forms of denial. First of all, he says there's simple denial, and this is where you deny that there is a problem altogether. Right? I mean, the check engine light is flashing on the dashboard telling you there is a problem, and you just ignore the light. Now, there's no problem here. And so you have this simple denial. He also talks about minimization. And this is where, we admit the reality that there is a problem, but we deny the seriousness of it. In other words, I realize that there's something going on, but it's not that big of a deal. You're making more of this than really you should. Of course, I see the check engine light on, and one of these days, listen, I'll get around to it, I'll take it in, I'll get it fixed. But it's really not that big of a deal. That's why they have these television shows like Intervention. How many of y'all have ever seen that on A&E? Where you've got these people who are addicted and their families and their friends, they come together and they surround these people and they're trying to tell them, listen, this is a big deal. And they're minimizing it. No, I don't have a problem. This is not that big of a deal. And so what they'll do on this show is the family and the friends will get together and they'll write out letters to the individual. And in these letters, what they're doing is they're saying, look, this is what you're doing. This is the damage you're leaving behind. These are the pieces that are scattered everywhere because of your problem. Because they want people to realize, people that they love, this is serious. And you're doing a lot of damage. And then thirdly, he talks about projection, and that is admitting the reality of an unpleasant fact that there is a problem, and maybe even admitting the seriousness of it, but denying responsibility. How many of you have ever heard someone say this? Well, I just can't help it. And what they're doing is they're just sloughing off, right, the responsibility. Or maybe they put it on someone else. Well, I wouldn't act this way. I wouldn't do this if it wasn't for my spouse. Or I wouldn't have responded this way if it wasn't for my boss. Or I wouldn't be this way if it wasn't for the church or if it wasn't for my parents. This is the way I'm wired. This is just who I am. And they take no responsibility for their actions whatsoever. And nothing changes. And they continue down that road. Where the alarm is going off for the prodigal son. And in verse 17, things get so bad that he begins to wake up. The light comes on. He throws the switch. It says, when he came to his what, church? His senses. In other words, when he came to his mind, that's really the phrase that we use today. When he came to his senses, the light finally came on. And you kind of see this moment, right? You see it unfolding in the text. You get this idea that the prodigal son, he is off by himself and he's feeding the pigs, and all of a sudden he begins to look around. And he's having this moment. Here I am, a Jew, and I'm feeding pigs. Here I am, and I'm even to the point to where I'm so hungry, I want to eat the slop that I'm feeding these pigs. And so he has this sudden awakening to where it's like, how in the world did I let it get this far? This is not the way it's supposed to be. This is not it. Sometimes it's hard to come to that conclusion because many times it's hard to see ourselves. Isn't it easier to see the mistakes and the problems of others than it is to see our own mistakes and problems? Man, we can be very quick, or at least I can, to point out the mistakes and the problems in other people. But man, it is so hard for me to recognize that within myself. And I think one of the ways that this can become hard for us is so oftentimes, if we're not careful, we can be tempted to look around at other people and compare, right? I mean, I realize I'm doing this, but man, look at what this person's doing. I mean, I'm a much better person. At least I'm not doing that. And so, see, we get to the point to where we start feeling really good about ourselves. It's not about our problems and our mistakes as much as it's, well, I'm not that bad. But it's hard for us to see. And so my prayer today, again, is that the light would come on for anyone here today that needs to throw the switch. You know, I opened up the lesson this morning about Rose Crawford and not being able to see for some 50 years and how she had the surgery and then they took the bandages off and she was finally able to see. And I told you, look, imagine what that must be like. But here's what I failed to tell you. That surgery was available 20 years earlier. And you know, one side of that you go, well, man, I'm glad she finally did it. But on the other side of that, you're sitting there going, man, that's heartbreaking that she waited 20 more years before she could actually see. And again, man, my prayer is that if there's anyone here that needs to wake up, maybe you need to wake up to who you are as a spouse, or maybe you need to wake up to the fact of who you are as a parent, or maybe you need to wake up to who you are as a Christian, or maybe you need to wake up to the fact that, man, there is a God and I need to be living for Him and I need to give my life to Him. I just pray that if there is someone here today that needs to throw the switch, that God will open the eyes of their heart and throw it. And that the light will come on. Right now I'm in the book of Jeremiah. And man, God is constantly sending His prophet Jeremiah to throw the switch in the lives of the children of Israel. Because they had been living so wickedly and they had been worshiping all these false gods. And so God sends Jeremiah to throw the switch. And He's even given Jeremiah all these different illustrations to use so that they could understand it and really get what God is trying to say. But the people of Israel they remained asleep. And God is telling them the whole time, listen, if you'll just wake up now, if you'll just come back to me now, listen, I will bless you. I will forgive you. I will restore you. And the people, they wouldn't listen. They just kept living the way they wanted to live. And God says, then I will be against you. He says, Jeremiah, don't even pray for me anymore. Because now my people are now my enemies. And He says, I'm going to take them to exile. I'm going to let them go to the distant country. And I'm going to let them live there apart from me as long as they want. So things see what it's like. But then He said, I'm going to bring them back. Because there are going to be some who are going to turn their hearts back to me. And that's the kind of God that we serve. He is so forgiving and He is so merciful. But He allows them to be taken off into exile. And for 70 years they sat in exile. And then God in His love and mercy, He brought them back. Because they turned back to Him. Because for many of them, the light came on. They had thrown the switch. And so this morning, there may be some of you, I don't know, I've just been praying this week, praying if there's someone who needs to respond today. Again, whether it's to come to Christ, put Christ on in baptism, or maybe it's a Christian here today that needs to be restored, rededicate their life to God, that today would be that day that maybe through this lesson, God has gotten your attention. and He's trying to wake you up. And so today, if you have a need, won't you come? One of our elders will come down front, and we would love to minister to you. We also have a room in the back if this is more of a private matter, but we'd love to minister to you in whatever way we can as together we stand as we sing.